You're shaking, Clara. Is it the weight of the diamonds or the weight of the lie? Theodore's voice didn't just fill the cathedral, it tore through the suffocating silence like a blade. I didn't have to look up to know his eyes were burning with a mix of shattered love and righteous fury, a look I hadn't seen since the night he was driven into the shadows. 3 years of silence, 3 years of mourning, a man I thought had abandoned me, and here he was, gripping my wrist with a desperation that told me he'd rather die than let me say those final 3 words to Lord Henry. I saw the tremor in his jaw, the raw shock in his gaze as he took in my white lace and the sapphire tiara that felt like a cold iron shackle. He wasn't just a jilted lover crashing a ceremony, he was a man holding the detonator to my entire world. In his hand, the weathered letter trembled, the evidence that the man standing at my other side, the man I was about to call husband, was the very monster who had orchestrated my father's ruin. Theodore had let me believe he was a coward to keep me safe, but as he leaned in, his breath hot against my cheek, the hidden truth finally spilled out. He didn't save your family, Clara, he devoured them, and I'm not letting you marry your father's executioner. Everything I thought I knew about my sacrifice, my duty, and my heart was a lie. He didn't just come to stop a wedding. He came to reveal a secret that would turn this holy sanctuary into a crime scene, and he wasn't leaving until I chose between the man who owned my debt and the man who owned my soul. The rhythmic, heavy thud of the debt collector's fist against the oak doors of Everleigh Manor was a sound Clara would never forget. It was the percussion of her family's downfall, a relentless beat that signaled the end of their era. 6 months ago, the grand hallways had been filled with the scent of fresh beeswax and late summer lilies. Now they smelled of stagnant dust and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Her father, Arthur Everleigh, was a man who had once been defined by the rigid, proud set of his shoulders and a laugh that could fill a ballroom. Now he sat slumped in his library, a room that had transitioned from a sanctuary of learning to a counting house of despair. He was surrounded by ledgers that read like a death warrant, the ink bleeding into the parchment like the life force draining from their name. The Everleigh reputation, polished by generations of aristocratic service and unblemished honor, was being stripped away, cent by cent, by creditors who smelled blood in the water. Every ship that had failed to return to the harbor, every investment in the northern mills that had mysteriously withered, and every banknote that had been called in early had led to this, a stack of eviction notices and the looming, suffocating shadow of Newgate Prison. Clara stood in the doorway, her breath hitching as she watched her father's trembling hands fumble with a fountain pen. The bankruptcy wasn't just a loss of coin, it was a loss of identity. To be an Everleigh was to be a pillar of the community. To be a bankrupt Everleigh was to be a ghost while still drawing breath. Then came Lord Henry Montague. He didn't arrive with the clamor of the collectors or the desperate shouting of the bailiffs. He arrived in a carriage that gleamed with a predatory, midnight luster, stepping into their crumbling world with the practiced grace of a man who knew exactly what everything and everyone was worth. He didn't knock, he was ushered in as if the house already belonged to him. Clara remembered how he had looked at her that afternoon. She had been sitting by the window, trying to repair a frayed lace collar to save a few pence on a seamstress. Henry's gaze hadn't been that of a suitor or a family friend. It was the clinical, cold look of a man inspecting a fine piece of porcelain he intended to buy at a steep discount because of a hairline fracture. He looked at her as if he were already measuring the space she would occupy in his home. "It is a tragedy, Arthur," Henry had said, his voice a smooth, comforting silk that didn't quite mask the glacial chill underneath. He sat across from her father in the library, sliding a glass of untouched, expensive brandy toward the broken man. "A man of your standing, your lineage, reduced to this by a few strokes of bad luck, or perhaps bad associates who didn't have your best interests at heart." Clara had watched from the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Henry had laid out his heroic offer with the surgical precision of a man who had planned every syllable months in advance. He would pay off the creditors. He would buy back the family's honor, clear the liens on the estate, and ensure her father never saw the inside of a cold, damp cell. The price, however, was not one her father could pay in gold or land. "I have long admired Clara," Henry had whispered, though his eyes remained fixed on the ledger. his fingers tapping a rhythmic, impatient code on the mahogany desk. A union between our houses would settle all debts. It would silence the gossips. I would become the son you need to manage these affairs, and she would become the mistress of a fortune that can never be drained. It is a simple trade, Arthur, your freedom for her hand. It was a trap baited with the sweetest form of salvation. To her father, Henry was a guardian angel appearing in the 11th hour, a man of means willing to sacrifice his own bachelorhood to save a friend. To Clara, standing in the cold draft of the hallway, he was the man who had watched her family drown just so he could be the one to pull her from the water at the cost of her soul. She remembered the way her father had looked at her that evening. The library was dim, lit only by a dying fire that cast long, distorted shadows on the wall. There were no words spoken, but the silent plea in his watery eyes was more piercing than any command. He was a man who had lost everything, and he was looking at his daughter to see if she would be the one thing he could keep. The crushing weight of his failure was a physical presence in the room, a third party to their grief. She had agreed to the engagement the following morning. She didn't do it for the diamonds Henry promised, nor for the security of the Montague name. She did it as a ransom payment. She had traded her future, her laughter, and the memory of the man she truly loved to keep her father from the gallows. She had signed the betrothal papers with a hand that felt disconnected from her body, never suspecting that the bad luck that had ruined the Everleighs had a human architect. Henry had played the part of the savior perfectly for months. He bought her gowns that felt like silk armor and jewels that weighed like lead. He paraded her through London's ballrooms, a trophy of his sudden dominance over an older, prouder house. Every time he touched her arm, Clara felt a shiver of revulsion, but she smiled for the sake of the man who now sat safely by his hearth at home. She convinced herself that this was the price of duty, the cost of a name. But as the memory faded, and the cold, hallowed reality of the cathedral altar returned, the truth began to claw its way out of the dark. The Duke's grip on her wrist was a physical anchor, pulling her out of the nightmare of the past 6 months. Theodore Blackwood, the man she had loved since she was a girl, the man she thought had abandoned her to this fate, was back, and he looked at her with a raw, bleeding honesty that Henry could never possess. Theodore didn't just stand there, he loomed over the proceedings like an avenging spirit. His tuxedo was dusty, his hair windswept, and his eyes were fixed on Clara with a focus so intense it felt as if they were the only two people in the vast, echoing cathedral. In his hand, the weathered letter crackled, a physical embodiment of the secret he had carried across oceans and through exile. "You think he saved you?" Theodore's voice was a low growl that vibrated in the very floorboards. He turned his gaze toward Henry, who was now a frantic shade of crimson, his mask of composure shattering. "He didn't save the Everleighs. He dismantled them. He bought your father's debt for pennies after he manufactured the crisis himself." The gasps of the congregation were like a sudden wind through the pews. Clara looked from the Duke to the man she was seconds away from marrying. The heroic offer she had sacrificed her life for was revealed to be a cold-blooded heist. The diamonds around her neck suddenly felt like they were choking her. The sapphire tiara, which she had viewed as a symbol of her family's restoration, was nothing more than a brand of ownership. The price of the Everleigh name had been her life, her happiness, and her heart. But as she looked at the second letter Theodore thrust into her trembling hand, a matching confession from a disgraced bank clerk, she realized the debt had been a lie all along. She wasn't a bride being saved, she was a victim being claimed. And for the first time in 6 months, Clara Everleigh stopped being a pawn and started to feel the fire of a woman who had been pushed too far. The silence that followed Theodore's revelation in the cathedral was not a true silence. It was a pressurized void, the kind that exists just before a dam breaks. As Clara looked into the Duke's storm-gray eyes, her mind was violently jerked away from the altar and cast back 3 years, to the night the world had turned cold. It was the night the ghost of the Blackwood was born, and the night the man she loved had vanished into the mist of the English Channel without a single word of goodbye. The memory was stained with the smell of salt spray and the bitter tang of wood smoke. It had been the height of the autumn social season, a time when the Blackwood and Everleigh families were expected to announce a union that everyone viewed as inevitable. Theodore had been her shadow, her confidant, and her heart's only compass. But that final night at the Blackwood estate had been stripped of all warmth. Theodore had summoned her to the edge of the cliffs, far from the glowing windows of the manor where their parents were toasted with vintage port. When she found him, he wasn't the vibrant, laughing man she knew. He stood silhouetted against a bruising purple sky, his coat snapping in the gale, looking as though he were already halfway to another world. His expression was a mask of agony, one he had refused to let her see until that very moment. "I have to leave, Clara," he had said, his voice barely audible over the crashing of the waves against the jagged rocks below. There was no preamble, no apology. "Leave for London?" she had asked, reaching for his hand, only for him to recoil as if her touch were a brand. "For anywhere but here," he replied. "And you must stay away from me. You must forget everything we spoke of in the gardens. If you value your father's life, you will treat my name as if it belongs to a dead man." The cruelty of his words had felt like a physical blow. She had begged for an explanation, demanding to know what sin he had committed or what debt he owed that could possibly outweigh their love. But Theodore had remained a statue of ice. He wouldn't look at her, gazing instead at the horizon as if he could see the ghosts of the future approaching. Before he turned to disappear into the fog, he had pressed a small, crumpled slip of paper into her palm. "Beware of the man who offers a hand when the floor begins to fall," he had whispered, a cryptic warning that made no sense in the golden prosperity of that year. "The devil doesn't come with a pitchfork, Clara. He comes with a contract and a smile you think you recognize." By the next morning, the Duke of Blackwood was gone. The scandals followed quickly, rumors of gambling debts, of a secret life in the darker corners of the continent, of a falling out with Arthur Everleigh so severe that her father forbade his name from being spoken within the manor walls. Theodore became a ghost, a cautionary tale of a highborn man who had squandered his soul. Clara had spent years mourning a man who was still alive, her grief curdling into a quiet, simmering resentment. She believed he had chosen exile over her. She believed his warning was merely the rambling of a man losing his mind to vice. But standing now at the altar, feeling the rough texture of the new letter in her hand, the cryptic warning of that night finally clicked into place like the tumblers of a lock. Theodore hadn't fled because of gambling or boredom. He had been a sacrificial lamb. She looked at Lord Henry, whose heroic smile was now a grotesque grimace of panic. Henry had been there that night 3 years ago. He had been the one to comfort her father after Theodore's departure. He had been the one to suggest that the Duke's sudden exit was a sign of guilt. He had stepped into the vacuum Theodore left behind, slowly weaving a web of financial ruin that would eventually leave the Everleighs with no choice but to turn to him. "You knew," Clara whispered, her voice gaining strength as the pieces of the puzzle aligned. "That night on the cliffs, you didn't leave because you wanted to. You left because he gave you a choice, your reputation or my father's life." Theodore's grip on her wrist softened, but he didn't let go. "He had proof of a mistake your father made 30 years ago, Clara, a mistake that would have sent him to the gallows. Henry promised to burn the evidence only if I vanished and never looked back. He wanted you, and he knew he could never have you as long as I was standing in his way." The congregation erupted into a fever of hushed whispers. The ghost of the Blackwood had returned not to haunt, but to exorcise the demon standing in the groom's clothes. The secret Theodore had never spoken, the reason for his years of silence and the loss of his own honor, was a love so fierce it had been willing to be hated by the one person he cherished most. Lord Henry lunged forward, his face contorted. "This is a fabrication, a desperate ploy by a man who has nothing left but lies." He reached to snatch the letter from Clara's hand, but Theodore stepped between them, a wall of navy wool and righteous iron. "I have everything I need, Henry," Theodore said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. "I have the clerk you paid to forge the Everleigh ledgers. I have the records of the shell companies you used to drain their accounts. And most importantly, I have the woman who is finally realizing that her hero is nothing more than a thief in a silk cravat." Clara looked down at the sapphire tiara she was still clutching. It was cold, heavy, and beautiful, the perfect symbol of the cage Henry had built for her. She thought of the 3 years she had spent hatting the man who had actually been saving her from the shadows. She thought of the ghost who had watched over her from across an ocean, waiting for the one piece of evidence that would allow him to return without destroying her father. The price of a name had been a lie. The exile had been a trap. And as Clara looked up at Theodore, the man she had branded a coward, she saw the hero she had thought was lost forever. The warning from the cliffs was no longer cryptic. The devil had indeed come with a smile she thought she recognized, but the Duke had returned with the fire to burn the devil's contract to ash. The weeks leading up to the wedding had not felt like a celebration of life, but rather the meticulous preparation of a burial. As the cathedral scandal raged in the present, Clara felt the phantom chill of her recent isolation at Montague Estate, a period where the gilded cage had finally begun to tighten its bars. While the world saw a bride-to-be draped in the finest silks London could provide, Clara had been living in a curated silence, sequestered away under the guise of rest and wedding preparations. Henry had insisted she move into a wing of his manor a month before the ceremony, claiming it would spare her the stress of the bailiffs still circling her father's home. It was a move presented as a mercy, yet once the heavy iron gates had swung shut behind her carriage, the atmosphere had shifted. The servants at Montague Estate did not look at her with the warmth of the staff at Everleigh. They looked at her with a mixture of pity and practiced indifference. They were not her attendants, they were her jailers, reporting her every movement back to the master of the house. During those long, suffocating afternoons, Clara had wandered the marble hallways, feeling like a specimen under glass. Henry's gifts arrived daily, extravagant bouquets of lilies that smelled of funerals, necklaces that felt like weighted collars, and the sapphire tiara that now sat in the center of the cathedral's chaos. But with every gift came a new set of rules. He began to dictate who she could write to, suggesting that her old friends were unsuitable for the wife of a Montague. He screened her father's letters, claiming the old man was too frail to be burdened by her replies. It was during the third week of her stay that the mask of the gallant savior finally slipped, revealing the jagged edge of the man beneath. Clara had been found in the library, attempting to use the telegraph to send a message to her father's solicitor. She had grown suspicious of the mounting administrative fees Henry was charging against her father's estate, fees that seemed designed to keep the Everleighs in a state of perpetual debt even after the marriage. She hadn't heard Henry enter. He moved with the predatory silence of someone who enjoyed catching others in a moment of vulnerability. When she turned, he was standing in the doorway, the afternoon sun casting his shadow long and distorted across the floorboards. "Checking the accounts, my love?" he asked, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm purr. "I thought we agreed that such burdens were no longer your concern." "I was merely curious, Henry," Clara had replied, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "The numbers don't seem to align with the initial agreement. It looks as though you are moving my father's remaining assets into your own private holdings." The change in him was instantaneous. The polished aristocrat vanished, replaced by a man whose rage was a physical, pulsing thing. He didn't shout. He crossed the room in 3 blurred strides and gripped the edge of the desk so hard the wood groaned. His face was inches from hers, his eyes dark with a possessive fury that made the air in the room feel thin. "You will listen to me very carefully," he hissed, his breath smelling of expensive tobacco and a cold, sharp malice. "I did not buy the Everleigh name so that I could be questioned by a girl who would be sleeping in a gutter if not for my charity. Your father is a broken old man, and you are a commodity. You will wear the jewels I give you, you will stand where I tell you to stand, and you will never, ever look into my ledgers again." To emphasize his point, he had reached out and swept a crystal inkwell off the desk. It shattered against the far wall, a spray of black ink staining the white wainscoting like a permanent bruise. Clara had frozen, her heart slamming against her ribs. In that moment, she realized that Henry didn't love her, he didn't even like her. He wanted to own her because she was the one thing the Duke of Blackwood had truly cherished. Her marriage wasn't a union, it was a conquest. He had caught her chin in his hand, his grip bruisingly tight, forcing her to look at him. "Smile, Clara, you have a wedding to prepare for, and remember, your father's freedom depends entirely on how well you play your part." He had left her then, trembling in the wreckage of the library, the ink still dripping down the wall. For the remainder of the month, she had lived in a state of hypervigilance, learning to read the tension in his jaw and the specific silence that preceded a burst of temper. She had learned to be a ghost in her own life, moving through the motions of dress fittings and guest lists while her soul retreated into a small, dark corner of her mind. She had felt the weight of the gilded cage, every time he touched her hand in public, a reminder that she was a bird with clipped wings, expected to sing for her captor. Every time she looked at the sapphire tiara, she didn't see a crown, she saw the price tag of her father's life. She had convinced herself that there was no escape, that the walls of Montague Estate were too high and the debt too deep. But now, back in the present, standing in the center of the cathedral with Theodore's hand on her wrist, that cage was being dismantled. The Duke wasn't just stopping a ceremony. He was breaking the bars that had been closing in on her for a month. Clara looked at Henry, the man who had shattered the inkwell, the man who had called her a commodity, and she felt the cold fear of the library being replaced by a white-hot spark of defiance. She wasn't a commodity, she wasn't a ransom payment, and as she gripped the letter Theodore had given her, the strength she had spent weeks hiding began to flow back into her limbs. The gilded cage had been strong, but it hadn't been strong enough to break the ghost of the Blackwood, and it certainly wasn't strong enough to hold her anymore. The rain in London didn't fall. It descended like a heavy grey shroud, soaking through the wool of Theodore's coat until it felt like a suit of lead. Every drop that hit the cobblestones of the East End seemed to echo the ticking of a clock he couldn't stop. It was 48 hours until Clara would stand at the altar, 48 hours until the woman he had ruined his own life to protect would be legally bound to a devil. Theodore moved through the shadows of the docks, his breath hitching in the damp air. For 3 years, he had been a man without a country, a duke in name only, living in the salt-stained taverns of the Mediterranean and the cold industrial hubs of the north, all to keep the secret of Arthur Everleigh's past buried. Henry Montague had been thorough. He had used a decades-old forgery from Arthur's youth, a desperate act by a young man trying to save a failing inheritance, to blackmail Theodore into exile. Henry had known that Theodore would never let Clara see her father in chains. He had counted on Theodore's nobility being his undoing. But Henry had forgotten one thing. A man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous man in the kingdom. Theodore turned into a narrow, suffocating alleyway near the Blackfriars Bridge, where the scent of rotting timber and river silt was overpowering. He was looking for a man named Elias Thorne, a disgraced clerk who had once been the lead bookkeeper for the Montague family. For months, Theodore had tracked Thorne across 2 continents, following a trail of breadcrumbs and blood money. Thorne was the only living soul who could prove that the Everleigh bankruptcy wasn't a streak of bad luck, but a calculated assassination of a family's fortune. Thorne, Theodore's voice, was a low, jagged rasp against the wind. A shadow shifted behind a stack of waterlogged crates. A small, trembling man emerged, clutching a tattered leather satchel to his chest as if it were a shield. Elias Thorne looked like a man who had been looking over his shoulder for 1,000 miles. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and frantic. "You have the coin," Thorne whispered, his teeth chattering. "He'll kill me for this, your grace. If Lord Henry finds out I've spoken, I'm a dead man by morning." Theodore stepped into the flickering light of a distant gas lamp, his face a mask of grim determination. "He's already killed you, Elias. You've been running for years. This is the only way you ever stop." He reached into his pocket and produced a heavy purse of gold, but he didn't hand it over. "The ledger, Elias, and the confession. I need the proof that the Everleigh debts were manufactured by Henry's shell companies." With a shaky hand, Thorne reached into his satchel and pulled out a weathered, handwritten letter and a series of bank transcripts. The ink was slightly blurred from the humidity, but the seal of the Montague counting house was unmistakable. As Theodore took the papers, his eyes flew over the numbers. It was all there. The loans Henry had supposedly given Arthur Everleigh were actually Arthur's own money, diverted through a series of fraudulent accounts before being lent back to him at ruinous interest rates. Henry hadn't saved the Everleighs. He had stolen their house and then charged them for the privilege of standing in the ruins. But there was more. Attached to the transcripts was a private note from Henry to the bank, dated the very night Theodore had been forced into exile. It detailed the plan to use Arthur's old forgery as the final lever to clear the field of any rival suitors. The realization hit Theodore like a physical blow. He had spent 3 years in a self-imposed prison, watching from afar as the woman he loved was slowly suffocated by a predator, all because of a lie he thought was an inescapable truth. His jaw tightened until it ached. The righteous fury that had been simmering in his gut for 1,000 days finally boiled over. He wasn't just a victim of blackmail, he was the witness to a grand theft of a woman's life. "Get to the docks," Theodore commanded, thrusting the gold into Thorne's hands. "There is a ship called the Valkyrie waiting for you, don't look back." Thorne didn't need to be told twice. He vanished into the fog like a ghost. Theodore stood alone in the rain, the weathered letter clutched in his hand. The paper was damp, the edges fraying, but it felt like the most powerful weapon in England. He looked toward the west, toward the spires of the city where the wedding preparations were undoubtedly reaching a fever pitch. He thought of Clara's face, the way she used to look at him with a trust that he had shattered for the sake of her father's safety. He thought of the sapphire tiara Henry had boasted about buying for her, a crown paid for with her own stolen inheritance. A dark, jagged laugh escaped his throat. 48 hours, he muttered to the empty alley. He didn't have a carriage, he didn't have an invitation, he had a horse, a ruined reputation, and a truth that would burn the cathedral to the ground. He swung himself into the saddle of his waiting stallion, the animal sensing the frantic energy of its rider. The midnight ride had begun. As he galloped through the mud-slicked streets of London, the wind whipping at his face, Theodore made a silent vow. He had played the martyr for long enough. He had let the devil win to save a man's pride, but he would not let the devil keep the woman who was the only light he had ever known. Every strike of the horse's hooves against the stone was a heartbeat closer to the altar. He would storm the church. He would grab her wrist. He would show her the ink-stained proof of the monster she was about to marry. The rain continued to pour, washing away the grime of his exile, leaving only the sharp, focused edge of a man who was coming home to claim what was his. The Duke of Blackwood was dead to the world, but Theodore was very much alive, and he was coming for his bride. The air inside the cathedral was thick enough to choke a saint. Incense coiled around the vaulted stone pillars like a white snake, and the heavy, floral scent of 10,000 lilies fought for dominance over the smell of cold, ancient dust. Clara felt the world narrowing until it was nothing more than the few inches of velvet carpet beneath her feet and the glint of the sapphire tiara in Lord Henry's hands. It was the moment of the crowning, a tradition of the Montague line that symbolized the final, irrevocable binding of the bride to the house. Henry's face was a mask of triumphant serenity. As he lifted the heavy, diamond-encrusted circlet, his eyes locked onto hers with a look that said, "You are mine." He leaned in, his voice a ghost of a whisper that only she could hear. "Smile, Clara, the debt is almost paid." The priest opened his mouth to deliver the final blessing, the 3 words that would seal her into a life of gilded misery. But the words never came. Instead, the great oak doors at the rear of the cathedral didn't just open, they shrieked on their hinges and slammed against the stone walls with the force of a cannon blast. The sound echoed through the rafters, shattering the reverie of London's elite. A cold, damp wind swept down the center aisle, fluttering the silk ribbons on the pews and chilling the sweat on Clara's neck. Theodore Blackwood stood in the doorway, a silhouette of jagged fury against the pale light of a London afternoon. He looked like a man who had ridden through the apocalypse. His navy tuxedo was stained with road grit, his boots were caked in mud, and his hair was a wild, windswept mess that mocked the curated perfection of the wedding guests. He didn't wait for an invitation. He marched down the aisle with a stride that demanded the floorboards yield to him. "Stop this farce!" His voice roared, vibrating in the very bones of the congregation. Henry's face transitioned from shock to a murderous, deep-veined purple. "Theodore, guards, remove this madman. He is a disgraced exile with no right to stand on holy ground." But Theodore was faster. He reached the altar before the confused ushers could move, stepping between Clara and the man who sought to own her. His presence was overwhelming, a heat that pushed back the chill of the cathedral. Without a word, he reached out and gripped Clara's wrist. His hand was rough, calloused, and trembling with a desperation that made her heart stop. It wasn't the grip of a captor, it was the grip of a drowning man finding a lifeline. "I am not here for your theatrics, Henry," Theodore hissed, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. I am here for the truth." In his right hand, he held a weathered, rain-stained letter, the physical embodiment of the midnight ride and the confession of Elia's thorn. But as he thrust it toward her, Clara felt a strange weight in her own left hand. In the chaos of his approach, she realized she was clutching a second letter, one that had been slipped into her bouquet earlier that morning by a trembling maidservant who had whispered, "For your eyes only, my lady." The double evidence. The cathedral fell into a vacuum of silence as Clara, her hands shaking so violently the lace of her sleeves rustled, opened both papers. The first, from Theodore, was the ledger of the Montague Shell Companies, the proof of the manufactured bankruptcy. The second, the one from her own bouquet, was a frantic, handwritten note from her father's own solicitor, who had finally found the courage to reveal that Henry had been paying him to stay silent about the Duke's true reasons for leaving. "Read them," Theodore commanded, his voice raw and bleeding. "Read how he stole your father's ships. Read how he threatened to hang your father unless I disappeared. He didn't save you, Clara. He hunted you." Henry lunged forward, his hand dropping the sapphire tiara. It hit the stone floor with a discordant, metallic clang, the blue stones skittering across the floor like discarded glass. "She is my betrothed. You have no standing here, you coward." "I have the standing of a man who stopped being a coward the moment I saw him reaching for your throat," Theodore countered, stepping closer into Henry's space, his height dwarfing the groom. Clara looked down at the letters. The ink on the ledger was cold and clinical, detailing the theft of her life in pounds and pence. The ink on the solicitor's note was frantic and blotted with tears. Together, they formed a map of a 3-year betrayal that had cost her everything she loved. She looked up at Henry, and for the first time, she didn't see a savior or a husband. She saw the man who had shattered the inkwell in the library. She saw the man who had called her a commodity. "Is it true?" she whispered, her voice small but cutting through the silence of the church. "Clara, darling, he is a madman," Henry pleaded, his voice cracking into a high, desperate register. "He's trying to ruin us because he's jealous of what I've built." "What you built?" Clara's voice rose, gaining a sharp, crystalline edge. She held up the letters for the entire congregation to see, the Duke's evidence and her own. "You built a cage out of my father's debts. You built a wedding out of a blackmailed exile." She looked at the sapphire tiara lying on the floor. It looked small now, insignificant. She looked at Theodore, whose eyes were glossy with a mix of relief and terror. He had risked everything, his life, the remains of his title, and his very freedom, to bring her these scraps of paper. "The vow was halfway to my lips," Clara said, her gaze turning to the priest, who stood frozen with the Bible in his hands. "But I will not marry a thief, and I will not be a ransom for a lie." She didn't wait for the priest to respond. She didn't wait for the guards to arrive. With a strength she hadn't known she possessed, she pulled her wrist from Theodore's grip, only to slide her fingers into his palm, interlacing them. It was a silent, public declaration that the ghost of the Blackwood was no longer in exile. Henry let out a scream of pure, impotent rage, a sound that finally stripped away his mask of aristocratic dignity. He looked less like a lord and more like a cornered animal, but the Duke didn't even look at him. Theodore's focus remained on Clara, a slow, disbelieving smile breaking through the grime on his face. "You came back," she whispered. "I never truly left," he replied. The crowning was over. The wedding was dead. And as the bells of the cathedral began to toll, not for a marriage, but for a scandal that would rock London to its core, Clara Everleigh realized that the secret he never spoke before had finally set them both free. The cathedral air, once stagnant with the scent of lilies, was now electric with the static of a public execution. Lord Henry Montague stood amidst the ruins of his perfect day, his breath coming in jagged, shallow hitches. For a heartbeat, the man looked broken, but then his eyes snapped toward the pews filled with the cream of London society. He saw the Duke of Devonshire whispering behind a gloved hand. He saw the Countess of Morley pulling her skirts away as if the scandal were a physical contagion. Henry's survival instinct, honed in the ruthless boardrooms where he had gutted the Everleigh fortune, surged to the surface. He adjusted his silk cravat, wiped the sweat from his brow, and turned to the congregation with a mask of trembling, wounded dignity. "My friends, my peers," Henry's voice rang out, projected with the false resonance of a stage actor. He held his hands out, palms up, the universal gesture of an innocent man. Look at this. Look at the tragedy unfolding before us. We all knew the Duke of Blackwood was a man of unstable temperament. We saw him flee the country 3 years ago under a cloud of gambling debts and dishonor. But I never imagined his obsession with my bride would lead to such a wretched display of lunacy. Theodore didn't move. He stood like a monolith of salt-stained wool, his fingers still interlaced with Clara's. He watched Henry with a terrifying, silent patience. Henry pointed a shaking finger at the letters Clara held. Look at those papers. They are the frantic scribblings of a man who has spent 3 years in the opium dens of the Levant. Do you truly believe that I, a man who has dedicated his life to the restoration of the Everleigh name, would be capable of such cartoonish villainy? Theodore Blackwood is a ghost seeking to haunt the living because he cannot bear to see the woman he abandoned find happiness in the arms of an honorable man. A murmur of uncertainty rippled through the pews. It was a clever play. To the high society crowd, a mad duke was a much more comfortable narrative than a predatory lord. It was easier to believe in a jilted lover's insanity than in the total corruption of one of their own financial titans. He stopped the wedding with a shout because he has no arguments left but noise. Henry continued, gaining momentum as he saw the doubt flickering in the eyes of the guests. He stepped toward the bishop, his voice dropping to a theatrical, mournful tone. Your Grace, surely you see the state of him. He is disheveled, he is violent, and he is clutching Lady Clara's hand against her will. This is not a revelation, it is an abduction. He has forged these documents to save his own pride, hoping to ruin a marriage that was built on the foundation of my own personal sacrifice. Henry turned back to Clara, his eyes softening into a look of predatory pity that made her skin crawl. Clara, my sweet, you are in shock. The stress of the day has made you vulnerable to this man's delusions. Drop those forged rags. Let the guards escort this poor, broken soul to Bedlam, where he might receive the care he so clearly requires. We can still finish this. We can still save your father. The mention of her father was the final twist of the knife, a subtle, public reminder of the blackmail that had brought her to the altar. Henry was betting on her fear. He was betting that the social pressure of 500 staring eyes would force her back into her cage. But the silence that followed was not filled by Clara's compliance. It was broken by Theodore, who stepped forward until he was inches from Henry's face. He didn't shout, he didn't lunge. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in velvet. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a signet ring, the one Henry had worn for years before losing it 6 months ago. You call me a madman, Henry, Theodore said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. But madmen do not carry the seals used to authorize the illegal seizure of the Everleigh shipping lanes. This ring was found in the desk of Elias Thorne, the clerk you tried to have murdered in Blackfriars. He kept it as insurance. He knew that one day, the man you call mad would come back to collect the debt you owe to the truth. Theodore turned his gaze from Henry to the congregation, his voice rising to fill the nave. Is it madness to show you the ledgers of a thief? Is it lunacy to reveal that your hero has been charging the Everleigh estate interest on money he stole from their own vaults? If this is madness, then God help every man in this room who values his honor, for you are all at the mercy of a monster who smiles while he hangs you. Clara felt the shift in the room like a change in the tide. The murmurs turned from uncertainty to a cold, hard judgment. She looked at Henry and saw the cracks in the porcelain. The sweat was no longer a sign of wounded dignity. It was the panicked sheen of a man who realized his escape tunnels had been caved in. The letters are not forged, Henry, Clara said, her voice steady and clear, echoing off the stained glass. Because a forgery cannot account for the way you looked at me in the library. A forgery cannot account for the bruises you left on my spirit. I am not in shock, and I am not vulnerable. I am simply finished. She raised the solicitor's letter, the one from her own bouquet, and handed it to the bishop. Read the signature, Your Grace. It is notarized by the High Court. Tell the congregation, is the Duke of Blackwood a madman, or is Lord Henry Montague a criminal? The bishop took the paper, his hands trembling as he adjusted his spectacles. The silence in the cathedral was absolute. Even the birds in the rafters seemed to stop their fluttering. As the bishop's eyes moved over the lines, his face drained of color. He looked up at Henry with a gaze of profound, holy revulsion. "This is no forgery," the bishop whispered, though in the silence it carried like a shout. "This is a confession of suborning perjury and the systematic theft of a peer's estate." The altar of lies crumbled. Henry's legs seemed to give way, and he slumped against the altar rail, the very rail where he had expected to receive a blessing. The madman stood tall, the grime of his journey looking like armor, while the savior looked like a heap of discarded silk. Theodore didn't gloat. He simply looked at Clara, a question in his eyes. He had broken the cage, but he was waiting for her to walk out of it. She didn't hesitate. She took the sapphire tiara from the floor, and with a look of quiet, incandescent power, she placed it on the altar rail next to Henry's trembling hand. "Keep your crown, Henry," she said. "I have found my name again." The vestry of the cathedral was a cold, windowless box of stone, smelling of frankincense and the damp rot of ancient parchment. Outside, the muffled roar of the congregation sounded like a distant sea, but inside, the silence was a physical weight. Lord Henry Montague stood by a heavy oak table, his fingers twitching toward the lapels of his ruined wedding coat. He was a man stripped of his stage, and in the dim light of a single tallow candle, he looked hollowed out, the predatory gleam in his eyes replaced by the dull glaze of a cornered animal. Theodore stepped into the center of the room, throwing the weathered, rain-stained letter onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud, the final nail in the coffin of Henry's ambition. "You thought the dead didn't speak, Henry," Theodore said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal rasp. "You thought that once Elias Thorne vanished into the fog of the East End, the paper trail of your life's work would vanish with him." Clara stood by the door, her lace gown a ghostly white against the grey stone. She watched as Henry's eyes darted toward the letter. It was the letter from the dead. The confession Elias Thorne had written while hiding in the rat-infested cellars of Blackfriars, believing every shadow was a Montague assassin. "Read it, Clara," Theodore said softly, never taking his eyes off Henry. "Read the words of the man who saw the ledger you were never meant to see." Clara stepped forward, her hands no longer trembling. She picked up the parchment. The ink was faded, stained by salt and time, but the handwriting was a frantic, desperate crawl. As she began to read, the full scope of the secret he never spoke finally bloomed in the dark. "To whomsoever finds this," the letter began. "I was the hand that held the pen, but Lord Henry Montague was the mind that held the knife. I witnessed the manufacture of the Everleigh ruin not over months, but years. It began with the sinking of the Siren's Call, a ship Henry knew carried no cargo, yet ensured the insurance premiums would bankrupt Arthur Everleigh. But my greatest sin, and the one that haunts my sleep, is the night of the Blackwood exile." Clara's breath caught. She looked at Theodore, whose jaw was set in a hard, pained line. "Lord Henry did not just blackmail the Duke with Arthur's past forgeries," the letter continued. "He created them. He forced me to forge Arthur Everleigh's signature on a series of treasonous correspondences with the French, documents that would have led to a gallows rope for Clara's father. He showed these to the Duke, telling him that the only way to keep the executioner away from Everleigh Manor was for Theodore to take the blame for a secondary debt and vanish forever. The Duke didn't leave because of his own dishonor. He left because he was told his presence was the only thing keeping the noose around Arthur's neck." The paper fluttered in Clara's hand. The secret wasn't just a financial theft. It was a total assassination of Theodore's life and character, built on a foundation of manufactured treason. Henry hadn't just stolen her future. He had weaponized Theodore's love for her, using it as the very tool to drive him away. "You monster," Clara whispered, the words feeling cold in her mouth. Henry let out a short, jagged laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Monster? I was a visionary, Clara. Your father was a weak man sitting on a fortune he didn't know how to protect. Theodore was a romantic fool who thought sacrifice was noble. I simply provided the world with the roles they were already playing. I gave your father a savior, and I gave you a husband who could provide for you." "You gave us a prison," Theodore roared, his composure finally snapping. He lunged across the table, grabbing Henry by the collar and slamming him against the stone wall. The candle flickered, casting their shadows into giant, warring shapes against the ceiling. "You let her hate me for 3 years. You let her believe I was a gambler and a coward while you sat at her father's table and drank his wine. And she would have been mine, Henry spat, his face inches from Theodore. If you had stayed in the gutter where I put you, she would be Lady Montague by sunset. She would have been safe, and her father would have died in a warm bed instead of a cold cell. I was the better choice, Blackwood. I was the one who stayed. Theodore's fist tightened on Henry's coat, but he didn't strike him. Instead, he looked back at Clara, his expression a raw map of the 3 years of agony he had endured. He had carried the weight of being a traitor and a coward to every port in Europe, all to ensure that the treasonous papers Henry held, papers that never truly existed, would never see the light of day. He never had the papers, Theodore, Clara said, her voice rising with a sudden, sharp clarity. If Thorne had the proof of the forgery all along, Henry was holding nothing but empty threats. Theodore let go of Henry, who slumped to the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Theodore looked at the letter from the dead clerk, then at the man he had once called a peer. The secret was finally out in the light, and it was smaller than he had feared. It was nothing more than the desperate lies of a man who could only win by cheating. "The clerk is dead, Henry," Theodore said, his voice now terrifyingly calm. "But his words are alive, and the king's guard is already at the cathedral doors. I didn't just bring a letter, I brought the testimony of every man you've stepped on to build your empire." The vestry door creaked open, and the bishop stood there, flanked by 2 men in the red tunics of the guard. Henry looked up, his face pale and drained. The visionary was gone. The savior was gone. There was only a thief, caught in a room filled with the ghosts of his own making. Clara walked over to Theodore and took his hand. His palm was calloused and scarred, the hand of a man who had worked and bled, far removed from the soft hands of the man on the floor. She felt the warmth of his skin, a reality she had denied herself for 1,000 days. "The secret is spoken, Theodore," she whispered. "And the debt is settled," he replied. As the guards moved forward to lift Henry from the floor, Clara didn't look back. She didn't need to see the fall of the House of Montague. She only needed to see the man who had come back from the dead to tell her the truth. The letter from the dead had given them back their lives, and as they walked out of the cold vestry and back into the light of the cathedral, Clara realized that the only crown she ever wanted was the one Theodore had saved for her, her own heart, finally and forever her own. The bishop's voice, usually a rolling thunder of divine authority, had thinned to a sharp, brittle reed. He stood at the edge of the dais, the heavy vellum of the clerk's confession trembling in his age-spotted hands. He looked down at Lord Henry Montague, the man who had funded the cathedral's new stained glass, the man who sat in the front pew every Sunday and saw not a pillar of the community, but a common architect of ruin. "Lord Henry," the bishop began, the words echoing off the high, vaulted ribs of the ceiling, "the sanctity of this house is built upon truth. These documents, they suggest a rot that no amount of gold can mask. To continue this ceremony would not be a blessing, it would be a sacrilege." The silence that followed was absolute, save for the distant, muffled sound of carriage wheels on the cobblestones outside. The congregation sat frozen, a sea of silk and wool paralyzed by the sudden collapse of a titan. Henry attempted to stand, his knees buckling slightly as he gripped the velvet-covered altar rail for support. He looked toward his peers, the dukes and earls he had courted with stolen capital, but found only a wall of cold, averted eyes. The social death of a nobleman is a silent thing. It is the sound of 500 people simultaneously deciding you no longer exist. "You cannot mean to take the word of a dead clerk and a disgraced exile over mine," Henry shouted, though the resonance had left his voice, replaced by a thin, desperate whine. "I have saved families. I have bolstered the very foundations of the London Exchange." "You have traded in blood and paper, Henry," Theodore interrupted, stepping forward into the pool of light falling from the rose window. He didn't look like a man seeking revenge. He looked like a man delivering a long-delayed bill. "You bolstered yourself by hollowing out your betters. The bishop has seen the ledgers. The guards have the testimonies. The fraud is no longer a secret whispered in shadows. It is a fact written in the light of day." Henry turned his gaze back to Clara, a final, flickering hope in his eyes. It was a look of profound, terrifying ownership. "Clara, think of your father, Think of the house. If you walk away now, everything I promised to protect will burn. Is this truly what you want? To cast your lot with a man who has nothing but a handful of old letters? Clara looked at the man who had held her family's life in his hands for 3 years. She thought of the library, the shattered inkwell, and the way he had called her a commodity. She felt the weight of the sapphire tiara no longer on her head, but resting on the rail like a discarded shackle. My father would rather die a pauper with his honor intact than live in a house built by a thief, she said, her voice clear and carrying to the very last row of the cathedral. And as for me, I would rather have nothing with a man who loves me than have the world with a man who only knows how to buy it. With a deliberate motion, she turned her back on Henry. It was the final, undeniable signal. The bishop closed the heavy, gold-leafed Bible with a definitive thump that sounded like a gavel. The ceremony is ended, the bishop announced. May God have mercy on the souls who sought to build a union upon such deceit. Scandal broke like a dam. The guards moved in, their red tunics a stark contrast to the white lilies of the wedding aisle. They didn't treat Henry with the deference his title had once commanded. They took him by the arms with a grim, practiced efficiency. As they led him toward the side exit, Henry's composure finally dissolved into a frantic, uncoordinated struggle. He looked back at the altar, at the space where his victory was supposed to be, and saw only the emptiness of his own making. The fallen groom was paraded past the very people he had sought to impress, his name turning into a slur before he had even reached the cathedral doors. The Countess of Morley raised her fan to shield her eyes from the sight, and the Duke of Devonshire turned his back completely. The disgrace was total. In a world built on the rigid pillars of reputation and lineage, Henry Montague had become a ghost before he had even left the room. Theodore didn't watch him go. His eyes remained fixed on Clara. The tension that had held his shoulders square for 3 years finally seemed to ebb, replaced by a raw, exhausted relief. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers, waiting for her to bridge the final gap. "It's over, Clara," he whispered, the words barely audible over the rising roar of gossip from the pews. "No," she replied, her fingers sliding into his, warm and solid. "It's finally beginning." The cathedral, which had been a site of impending doom, now felt vast and filled with air. The gilded cage had been dismantled, the predator had been led away in chains, and the ghost of the Blackwood had stepped back into the world of the living. As they stood together at the altar of a wedding that never happened, Clara realized that the most beautiful thing about the day wasn't the diamonds or the lace. It was the truth, standing beside her, holding her hand. The heavy double doors of the cathedral had finally closed against the prying eyes of the ton, leaving Theodore and Clara in the sudden, echoing hollow of the nave. The frantic energy of the scandal still vibrated in the air, but between them, there was only the quiet, rhythmic sound of breathing. Theodore stood before her, the grime of his desperate journey a stark contrast to the pristine marble of the altar. He looked like a man who had spent 3 years carrying the weight of a mountain, only to find his arms suddenly empty. "I should have told you," he began, his voice cracking with the strain of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. He reached out as if to touch the lace of her sleeve, then pulled back, mindful of the road dust on his skin. That night on the cliffs, when the wind was howling and the world felt like it was breaking apart, I wanted to scream the truth until my lungs gave out. I wanted to tell you that Henry was a snake, that your father was being bled dry by a man he called a friend." Clara watched him, her heart aching with a mixture of love and lingering pain. "Then, why did you leave me to the mercy of that snake, Theodore? Why let me believe you were the one who had failed us?" Theodore closed his eyes, a pained grimace flitting across his face. "Because he held the noose, Clara. He showed me the letters, the ones Thorne's confession now proves were forged. He convinced me that your father had committed treason against the crown. He told me that if I stayed, if I fought him, he would turn those papers over to the magistrate. I saw your father's face in my mind, the old man who had been like a second father to me, dangling from a rope, while the Everleigh name was dragged through the mud of history. Henry gave me a choice, my reputation for Arthur's life, my presence for your safety." He stepped closer, the heat of his body radiating through the cold air of the church. "I thought that by becoming the villain of your story, I was ensuring you actually had a story left to live. I chose a life of exile so you could have a life of peace. But I didn't realize that in saving your father's neck, I was handing your soul over to the very man who had tied the knot." Clara reached out, her fingers brushing against his callous palm, drawing him back to the present. The anger that had sustained her through the months of her engagement began to dissolve, replaced by a profound, sobering clarity. Theodore hadn't been a coward. He had been a martyr for a cause she hadn't known existed. He had lived in the shadows so she could walk in the sun, never realizing that for her, the sun had gone out the moment he vanished. "You tried to carry it all alone," she whispered. "You thought my love was so fragile that it couldn't withstand a struggle, so you chose to break it instead." "I was a fool," Theodore admitted, his eyes searching hers with a raw, pleading intensity. "I thought honor meant silence. I thought protecting you meant keeping you in the dark. But seeing you stand there, about to give yourself to him, I realized that the greatest dishonor was letting you believe you were unloved. I would rather the whole world burn than see you spend another night in that man's house." He fell silent then, the weight of his redemption hanging in the air. He wasn't asking for her hand, not yet. He was giving her back the agency Henry had spent years stripping away. He was standing there, a duke with a ruined name and a heart full of scars, waiting for her to decide what happened next. Clara looked at the altar, then back at the man who had fought through the dark to find her. For months, every choice in her life had been made by men, by her father's debts, by Henry's greed, by the crushing expectations of a society that viewed her as a bargaining chip. She had been moved across the board like a silent pawn in a game of high-stakes chess. "My whole life has been a series of prices paid for a name I didn't choose," Clara said, her voice growing stronger, more resonant. "First for my father, then for Henry's vanity. Everyone told me what I owed Theodore. Everyone told me what my duty was." She took a step toward him, closing the final gap until their chests nearly touched. The scent of rain and salt from his coat was more intoxicating than any perfume. "But for the first time, I am making a choice that belongs to no one but me. I am not choosing you because you saved me. I am not choosing you because I am in your debt." She reached up, her hands cupping his face, her thumbs tracing the weary lines around his eyes. "I am choosing you because I love the man who was willing to be hated to keep me safe, and I am choosing to never let you carry a secret alone ever again." Theodore's breath escaped him in a long, shuddering sigh of relief. He leaned into her touch, his forehead resting against hers as the last of the 3-year winter finally thawed. There were no crowds now, no gossips, no creditors. There was only the truth and the quiet promise of a future that wasn't bought or sold, but built. "Where do we go?" he asked softly. Clara smiled, a real, radiant smile that hadn't touched her lips since the night on the cliffs. "Wherever we want, Theodore. For the first time in my life, the door to the cage is open, and I think I'd like to see what the world looks like when I'm flying." As they walked out of the cathedral hand in hand, the bells began to ring again, not for the wedding that failed, but for the life that had just begun. The story reaches its climax when the bishop, seeing the seal of the royal court on Theodore's evidence, declares the marriage contract null and void before it is even signed. Lord Henry's rage turns to cowardice as he realizes his financial empire was built on sand, crumbling under the weight of his own forgeries. As the congregation whispers in shock, Henry is escorted from the cathedral by the king's guard, leaving Clara standing at the altar, finally free of the debt that nearly drowned her and her family.